Mr. Ward, if you're available, we would love to hear your presentation.
President Corr, Superintendent Horn, Vice President Haley. So I appreciate all of the parents who showed up today to share their feedback and concerns regarding the handbook. After hearing some of this feedback, it is clear to me that we could clarify some of the misconceptions that exist around this handbook. So I will use this opportunity to just touch upon some of the larger substantive changes that we were initially proposing in the handbook. So the purpose of this revised handbook was obviously to comply with Arizona Administrative Rule, which requires that the Department of Ed present a handbook to this body every year. And most importantly, we were very interested as a department, as an ESA staff, in ensuring that we had a handbook that was very useful to ESA families. We understand that this program is so important to these families, and so we wanted to put the best handbook forward that we could. Next slide, please. So in considering parent feedback, starting in September, we sent out monthly emails to parents asking for feedback on the current handbook in preparation for this handbook that we were going to propose. And so we received over 125 comments from parents during that time period. We meet quarterly with a parent advisory committee. In the very last parent advisory committee, we asked for their feedback on the handbook. We gave them a heads up so that they could prepare to provide substantive feedback to us. So we received that and we heard it. And my ESA staff, who spends a lot of time working with ESA families because they're on the telephone with them, trying to serve them as best possible, they are very aware of the concerns and issues that parents have. And so I relied heavily on that staff as well in preparing this handbook. And I will say, amongst the majority of the feedback that we got from parents, starting in September, late September, the majority was integrated into the new handbook. Next slide, please. So there were two types of revisions that we made to the handbook. The one I just want to quickly touch upon are the style revisions. There was a lot of duplication in the current handbook, and so we tried to streamline the handbook again to make it more user-friendly to ESA families, so we reduced duplication. I think after 11 years or 12 years of the program and the handbook, things had just been layered on top of each other over and over. And so things often felt disjointed in that handbook. And so we reorganized information within the handbook. And also from a readability perspective, most of it was written in passive voice, which I think is very difficult for people to consume quickly and easily and can create confusion. And so we revised most of it to be in active voice. So those are the stylistic changes that we made to try to make it more user-friendly to our families. But next slide, please. But there were some substantive changes that we wanted to touch upon in the handbook that we drafted, and there were 4 substantive revisions. The purpose of these revisions was to increase compliance with state law and to ensure that we had within the department prudent stewardship of the ESA program for its long-term viability and health. Next slide, please. So the very first change that we made to the handbook was to be very clear that account holders will no longer be able to use the Empowerment Scholarship Program solely for summer use. So we have situations in which families are entering the ESA program after the public school year has ended, so sometime in late May, early June. And so when they apply, they receive all of quarter 4 funding. A couple of weeks later, after July 1, when Q1 has started, they also then receive the quarterly funding for Q1. And then shortly before the next school year begins, public school year, these students exit the ESA program and are back in public school. And so essentially what has happened is that you've had these students funded for 2 quarters for summer enrichment, and essentially they were never committed to being part of the ESA program. Next slide, please. Now, within state law, it says that in 152403H that the department shall accept applications between July 1 and June 30th of each year. So year-round, we accept applications. This is not an application issue. This is a funding issue. State law 152402C is very clear that ESA students are allocated 90% of the funding that they would have received had they gone to their local school district. But in the scenario that I've just outlined, what you end up having is a student who gets more than 1.0 ADM from state funding. And so in this case, a student could end up with 1.25 ADM funding, or if they've done this over multiple summers, which some families do, they end up with 1.5 ADM funding within the year, which is not consistent with 152402. So that's the statutory basis that we believe we have to make this recommendation. Next slide, please. The next substantive change that we have was that private schools should not be custodians of empowerment scholarship accounts. So what has come to our attention is that there are some schools who establish ESA accounts for their families. They will they will create email accounts and passwords to create the login. And essentially they have total control over the ESA accounts of these families. So we've had families call in and say that they don't have access to their own ESA account, or in worst case scenario, that they weren't even aware that they were part of an ESA program, because these schools have created these logins for them and have full access to them. So to diminish this conflict of interest, we are asking parents, and we are making very clear in the handbook, that schools should never have your login credentials, whether it be the password and their emails, that they alone should be the sole custodians of their accounts. Next slide, please. The third big substantive change that we proposed in this draft was that students with a disability after their 12th grade cohort year must annually submit an education plan. So for those students who have reached their 12th grade cohort year and they wish to stay in the program, the current practice is that they will sign an attestation, their parents will sign an attestation that they have not graduated or earned their GED, and that they would benefit by continuing to remain in the program. Next slide, please. Now, within 152402-4N, which covers this issue, it gives the Department of Ed the responsibility to identify the minimum qualifications for the evaluation teams that would put together these annual education plans, as well as the factors that the evaluation teams would use in their work. And so while attestation, I understand for families who have students with a disability, is very easy and user-friendly, it's not contemplated by state law. And so the department's overriding goal with this one is to ensure that we are, that our practices are consistent with state law and those expectations. Now, I understand also for those families who have students with a disability, they may assume that if they have to get these annual education plans, it's going to be very onerous for them, because at the public school, getting an IEP and having an MET can often feel very, very burdensome. And so the Department of Ed is not interested in any way in overburdening these families. And so we will be creating an evaluation team that is as least onerous as possible. Likely that evaluation team would consist of a qualified examiner, which is a doctor, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, a parent, and a school official. So with regard to cost and time, our overriding interest is to ensure that this is not onerous, but that we are following state law. Next slide. And the last item, and parents have commented quite a bit on this, is that items that do not involve a reasonable expense will not be approved by the Department of Education. And the way that we are defining items that do not involve a reasonable expense is supplemental items that are designer items or items whose prices are at or near the highest end of the range for the item type. Next slide, please. And our overriding concern and goal with this requirement is that the Department of Ed wants to be a very good and prudent steward of this program. And so when there are extravagant purchases being made, it puts the program in a very difficult position. So we have recently had families try to, an account holder tried to buy a luxury wristwatch that was $15,000, massage chairs that are $5,000, and golf simulators that are $24,000. So these are not the types of items that the Department of Education is going to approve in with its goal of trying to be a prudent administrator of this program. And for that reason, we feel like we have a solid basis for this. Furthermore, there was a recent ESA appeal decision that this board approved, which supports the Department of Ed's position. Recently, an account holder tried to buy a $2,400 food freeze dryer, and we denied that purchase. The hearing officer agreed that that purchase was not allowable, and this board approved the hearing officer's position. So this body itself has also appears to have supported our position. Next slide. Furthermore, there may be a question of whether the department has the authority to implement that type of limitation on purchases. But when we look at State Board Rule R7-2-1507A, it says the department shall establish and maintain a database of approved expenses and disallowed expenses for the current and upcoming fiscal year. So this rule acknowledges the department's authority to identify and create these lists of approved and unapproved items. And so we feel like we have the basis in board rule to do this. And furthermore, in not approving extravagant items or items that don't have, that are beyond a reasonable expense, again, all of those categories in state law that are allowable purchases, the department continues to allow all of those types of purchases within those categories. We just won't allow things that are extravagant within those categories if they fall into them. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. President Kaur, Vice President Haley, Superintendent Horn, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Ward. Are there questions from panel? Ms. Clark, Member Clark.
Thank you, Vice President Haley. The only thing I want to mention before we potentially dig into a bunch of questions is just to remind the board that Director Ward was presenting on the draft, but the motion is now no longer for the draft. The motion now from the department and from the superintendent is to keep the current handbook for another year. So I just mentioned that because I don't want us to go down a series of questions related to the draft when that's not the motion that's on the floor.
Thank you. Are there any other questions about Mr. Ward's presentation today? Oh, Member Tovar, please.
Thank you, Vice President Haley. Thank you, Mr. Ward, for your presentation. Just a couple of questions. They're coming, what we heard earlier from parents that were testifying and coming in person and online. So quick question. A lot has been said in regards to the parent involvement. and allowing them to provide feedback. There's mention of, there was past town halls that were established. And I'm not sure how many years ago that those took place. Maybe if you could walk me through, you had mentioned there was 125 comments from parents. And then from there, it went to a parent advisory committee as well, too. And also you had mentioned there was numerous of emails that I guess were sent to parents as well, too. First question would be, do you consider 125 comments, I would say quite a bit of comments in typical of what you've received in the past?
So President Core, Vice President Haley, Superintendent Horde, members of the board. The comments that we got, I think, are fewer than we've got in the past. But if one recalls last year's hearing regarding the parent handbook, there was much more dissatisfaction with that handbook than there is today. And so I think it is a function of the fact that there were less issues with it. I believe we have, one of the parents mentioned there are 100 pages of comments with regard to the draft itself. I believe there were 400 pages last year. And so with regard to parent feedback, obviously I support where we're at in the Department of Ed and the superintendent's position that if we need to continue to solicit feedback, we're going to do that and we're going to do it well. But giving parents several opportunities going back to late September through surveys to provide information, we felt was a very reasonable way and a very orderly way of collecting this information. In the past, there had been webinar meetings and they had collected some information that way. I think it was hard to document all of the comments and concerns that parents had. And so having them submitted in this written fashion was a much more orderly and documented way of doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. And thank you for that baseline, because as a new member, I'm not familiar with what has transpired in the past as well. So thank you for that. You'd mentioned a lot of the revisions on the handbook that was the draft are essentially what you feel would be appropriate in abiding by state law. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And also in regards to a question and a comment that was made by many parents was in regards to the payment vendor system. Maybe if you can explain a little bit to me as being a new member in regards to maybe there seems to be some type of lag in regards to payments being processed and paid. So maybe if you can walk me through that system of how usually they come to fruition and how quickly they can get payments processed.
So with the growth of the program, because it has been so popular and served parents so well, there has been an explosive growth in the sheer volume of purchases that come through on a daily and weekly basis. And so we have been doing our very best as good stewards to carefully review the items that are coming in and get them approved. And so I understand that there absolutely has been some lag time for parents waiting for their orders to come in. We have, as a department, been exploring ways that we could be more efficient and more effective, and we have implemented these changes. And so the reduction of the backlog has been reduced dramatically. And so we're at the point now where for those students and those families who are submitting invoices for direct payment, we're within 3 weeks of that. Let me just, for those who are seeking reimbursement, we are still about 2 months out, but we were much further out than that. And we're trying to triage. We're obviously trying to get to address those reimbursements that are largest and oldest first to get through this backlog. But we do acknowledge that, yeah, there has been some wait time, but we are absolutely proactively working with Class Wallet to find, and we're working on automation and other procedures that are going to help us stay on top of all of these purchases.
Thank you, Director Ward, on that. When you'd said, there was an expansive amount of growth where you were inundated, what has been the current staff that goes through the actual invoices, and have you increased that as well?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of your question.
That's okay.
Mrs. Taylor.
How have you increased staff in regards to processing invoices? Because it sounds like something happened where you're able to process a bit more.
So we are in the process of hiring staff. We had some staff just start last week
Mhm.
that is helping us to stay on top of some of this. But we're also improving our just our procedures with Class Wallet to be able to review these things more quickly
Thank you.
through automation.
Thank you. My last question in regards to the draft itself. So, your department went through it, many iterations of it, of the handbook. My question, and maybe if you don't have the answer, maybe a Superintendent Horn does. Was this something that the superintendent signed off on the latest draft in regards to the revision that he approved of as well?
Yeah, all of the what's included in this handbook is always a conversation within the Department of Ed. And superintendent is always kept abreast. I would never move forward without the superintendent's support.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Ward. No further questions, Madam Chair.
Much. All right. Do we have any other questions pertaining to Mr. Ward's presentation? Seeing none, I think we will now proceed with the original motion that was first made by Superintendent Horn and second by Member Clark. I'll restate it before we vote. The motion is that that the board will vote to adopt last year's handbook to be used for this year. Specifically, a motion that the state board will adopt the 2023-2024 school year ESA handbook as the ESA handbook for the 2024-2025 school year. So motion's already been made. It's been seconded by Member Clark. I guess we'll now move forward with the vote. Is that correct?
Vice President Haley, Superintendent Horn, members of the board, because there has been a gap in time between, it would be helpful if the motion could be remade and second. So if we could just go through the process again for
Okay.
clarity, that would be great.
So with that, do I have a motion that the state board to adopt the 2023-2024 school year ESA handbook to serve as the 2024-2025 ESA handbook?
So move.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Member Clark? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
One opposed. And any abstentions? Okay, the ayes have it.